The previous discussion left the structure standing before us as an object already complete, its mass and position unquestioned, its presence taken as given. What remains uncertain is not that these raised platforms existed, but how they were first described by those who laid their foundations. The earliest voices we have are not storytellers or priests, but scribes recording what was placed beneath the ground before the first bricks were raised. Foundation inscriptions associated with ziggurats appear early in the written record, often sealed within clay cones, bricks, or small tablets embedded into the core of the structure. These texts are brief, formulaic, and notably restrained. They identify a ruler, name a city, record a construction act, and sometimes specify dimensions or materials. What is striking is not what they say, but what they do not. Invocations to deities are present, but sparse. Instructions for ritual use are absent. The language does not linger on ceremony. Instead, it settles quickly into statements of authority and completion. Measurements recur with quiet insistence. Lengths, widths, counts of bricks, and references to standardized units appear where one might expect hymns or dedications. In several inscriptions, the act of building itself is framed as an administrative duty fulfilled according to precedent. The text often closes not with praise, but with a warning. Future rulers are instructed to preserve the inscription, to restore the structure if damaged, and to maintain the name recorded there. The concern is continuity, not devotion. Foundation deposits recovered beneath ziggurats reinforce this impression. Alongside inscribed objects are tools, modeled bricks, and symbolic representations of labor. These are not offerings meant to be seen, but records meant to remain buried. Their placement suggests a communication not with participants in ritual, but with successors. The buried text functions as a message sent forward in time, ensuring that the act of construction is remembered accurately and repeated correctly if necessary. The vocabulary used in these inscriptions further complicates a purely religious reading. Terms associated with ordering, establishing, and setting in place appear more frequently than words associated with worship. Verbs describe actions performed on materials, on ground, and on labor forces. Even when divine names are included, they are often positioned as witnesses rather than recipients. The gods are acknowledged, but the structure itself is treated as an object within a system of governance. Some inscriptions list the mobilization of workers, the sourcing of mud and reeds, and the coordination of craftsmen. These details resemble administrative records more than liturgical texts. They read like confirmations that a task was completed according to expectation. The ziggurat, in this light, emerges not first as a sacred destination, but as a managed project whose legitimacy depends on correct execution. The absence of explicit ritual instruction is particularly notable when contrasted with other Sumerian texts. Hymns, prayers, and festival descriptions survive in abundance elsewhere. When ritual mattered to scribes, they recorded it with care. That such language is largely missing from foundational texts may suggest that the function of the structure was understood without the need for explanation, or that its primary role was not ritual performance at all. There is also the question of audience. These inscriptions were not meant for congregations or processions. Buried within walls or beneath floors, they were inaccessible once construction was complete. Their audience was conceptual rather than physical. Future builders, future rulers, and perhaps future scribes tasked with restoration. The text assumes a reader trained in measurement, authority, and precedent, not one seeking spiritual guidance. Even the formulaic curses included at the end of some inscriptions reflect this orientation. The threat is not that divine favor will be withdrawn from worshippers, but that a future ruler who alters the structure or erases the inscription will disrupt an established order. The concern is the integrity of the record. The punishment described is often framed as administrative disorder rather than sacrilege. Archaeological context supports this reading. In several sites, foundation inscriptions are paired with construction layers that show careful planning and standardized methods. Brick sizes remain consistent across phases. Orientation is preserved through rebuilding. These patterns imply adherence to an inherited template. The structure is not reinvented with each reign, but restored according to remembered specifications. This raises a quiet problem. If ziggurats were conceived primarily as temples, one might expect their foundational texts to emphasize ritual access, priestly roles, or divine presence. Instead, the language points toward stability, record-keeping, and authority. The structure is anchored not by ceremony, but by documentation. Its legitimacy rests on inscription as much as on belief. The texts suggest that the act of building was itself sufficient. Once constructed according to proper measure and authority, the structure fulfilled its role. Whatever occurred above ground may have mattered less than the fact that the foundation was laid correctly and remembered accurately. The buried inscription becomes a guarantor of order, a quiet assertion that this place was established as intended. If the earliest words associated with these platforms describe labor, measurement, and preservation rather than ritual use, it invites a reconsideration of how function was understood at the moment of origin. Were these structures conceived first as sacred spaces, later absorbed into administration, or were they administrative anchors from the beginning, later enveloped in religious language? And if their foundations speak more clearly of order than worship, what kind of activity was expected to take place upon them once they rose above the city? If the foundation texts speak quietly of order and continuity rather than ceremony, the ground plan above them extends that silence into space. Once the first courses of brick rose from the buried inscriptions, the ziggurat did not emerge in isolation. It took shape within a city already dense with paths, walls, courtyards, and controlled points of entry. Archaeology allows this spatial relationship to be traced with some precision, and what appears is less a sanctuary set apart than a structure embedded within systems of movement and restriction. Excavations at several major Sumerian cities show that ziggurats were consistently placed within tightly managed precincts. These precincts were enclosed by walls that separated them from residential quarters, not in the manner of open gathering spaces, but as zones of regulated access. Gates were few, routes were narrow. The approach to the raised platform was deliberate and indirect. Such layouts suggest that movement toward the structure was controlled rather than encouraged, filtered rather than invited. The stairways themselves reinforce this impression. Monumental staircases are often cited as evidence of ceremonial ascent, yet their number and orientation complicate that reading. Many ziggurats possessed a limited set of stairways, sometimes only one primary ascent, aligned carefully with surrounding buildings, where patterns on surviving steps indicate repeated use, but not the broad dispersal expected from large public crowds. Instead, traffic appears concentrated and directional, as if serving a specific group accustomed to the route. Above ground level, architectural features continue this logic. Platforms narrow as they rise, reducing usable space rather than expanding it. Upper terraces often lack clear evidence of congregational accommodation. There are no wide plazas, no extensive railings, no architectural gestures that would facilitate mass presence. What remains are enclosed or semi-enclosed areas, difficult to access and easy to oversee. Visibility also plays a role. From the summit or upper levels of a ziggurat, lines of sight extend across the city and its surrounding fields. This vantage point offers oversight rather than intimacy. It allows observation of storage yards, canals, and administrative quarters. In contrast, the structure itself remains visually dominant from below, its mass signaling authority without revealing interior activity. The relationship is asymmetrical. The city sees the platform, but the platform governs what may approach it. Surrounding buildings provide further context. Excavations frequently reveal clusters of storerooms, workshops, and offices adjacent to ziggurats. These structures are utilitarian in form, with benches, bins, and seal impressions indicating record-keeping and controlled distribution. Their proximity suggests functional integration. The raised platform stands not at the center of ritual performance, but at the apex of an administrative landscape in some sites. Drainage systems and reinforced foundations beneath ziggurats indicate concern with long-term stability and protection of stored materials. Channels divert water away from the core. Brick compositions vary between layers, suggesting planned maintenance rather than symbolic design. These choices reflect priorities aligned with preservation and durability, not temporary ceremonial display. Circulation within the precinct is equally revealing. Paths curve and narrow as they approach the platform, limiting speed and visibility. Courtyards are segmented. Doorways are offset rather than aligned. Such design discourages spontaneous movement and favors familiarity with the space. Those who worked there would know the routes. Those who did not would be slowed or stopped. Comparative analysis with clearly identified temples elsewhere in Mesopotamia sharpens the contrast. Temples often include broad courtyards, altars, and architectural markers that guide ritual movement. Ziggurat precincts, by contrast, appear inward-facing and procedural. Their architecture organizes bodies and goods rather than devotion. The emphasis is on regulation of access, not congregation. This does not exclude religious significance, but it reframes it. If ritual occurred on or near ziggurats, it did so within a spatial system already shaped by control. The architecture does not foreground participation. It presumes authorization. Elevation becomes a means of separation, not ascent for its own sake. Height restricts as much as it elevates. Archaeological layers also showed that these spatial arrangements persisted through rebuilding phases. Even after destruction or flood deposition, later reconstructions often replicate earlier circulation patterns. This continuity suggests that the management of space was inherited, not improvised. The form was remembered because its function remained necessary. When the ziggurat is read as part of an administrative topography, its raised form acquires a different meaning. Elevation protects, oversees, and limits. It distinguishes those permitted to ascend from those who remain below. Architecture becomes a tool for managing visibility, movement, and authority, embedding governance into brick and stair. If the city was organized through flows of labor, goods, and information, the raised platform appears positioned to anchor those flows rather than receive offerings. And if access to height was restricted by design, One is left to wonder who was meant to climb these stairways regularly, and for what kind of work that required separation from the city. Beneath them, the controlled movement and restricted access shaped by the surrounding architecture point toward intention rather than ornament. When attention shifts from space to the language of power that authorized its construction, a similar restraint appears. The rulers who commissioned these raised platforms did not describe them as moments of inspiration. They recorded them as obligations fulfilled. Royal inscriptions from the early dynastic and your three periods repeatedly return to building as a central duty of kingship. In these texts, the ruler does not present himself as a visionary architect or a favored devotee. He appears instead as a caretaker of inherited forms. Construction is framed as something that must be done because it was done before, and because its absence would signal disorder. King lists reinforce this tone, while later traditions remember rulers through feats of war or extraordinary reign lengths. Earlier records are markedly procedural. Reigns are measured. Successions are orderly or explicitly disrupted. Within this framework, building projects, including ziggurats, are noted not as unique achievements, but as expected acts that confirm legitimacy. A king who builds is not exceptional. A king who fails to build is suspect. Several inscriptions make this explicit by tying construction to continuity rather than devotion. The ruler identifies himself as the restorer of what had fallen into disrepair, or as the one who rebuilt according to ancient plans. The language implies prior existence and prior knowledge. The act of building does not create something new. It reasserts what should already be there. Authority is derived from alignment with precedent, not from innovation. Labor appears prominently in these texts. Kings record the gathering of workers, the organization of crews, and the allocation of materials. These details are not incidental. They demonstrate command over people and resources. The successful completion of a ziggurat signals that the ruler can mobilize the city, coordinate effort, and impose order over time. The structure stands as evidence that governance functions. Notably absent is prolonged theological explanation. Deities are acknowledged, but often as guarantors of order rather than as recipients of devotion. The king builds because it is his role within a larger system, one that predates him and will continue after him. In some inscriptions, the ruler even distances himself from personal agency, presenting the act as mandated by tradition or inherited instruction. This framing is reinforced by texts that warn future kings. Alteration of the structure or neglect of its maintenance is treated as a violation not primarily against the gods, but against the established order of kingship. The offense lies in breaking continuity. The punishment described is the loss of legitimacy, instability, or the erasure of one's name from memory. Construction, in this sense, is a safeguard against forgetting. One kingship text describes building as a burden carried correctly or incorrectly. The ruler lists tasks performed not to boast, but to demonstrate compliance. The tone is administrative. Completion matters more than grandeur. Accuracy matters more than display. The structure becomes a visible confirmation that the ruler understands his place within an inherited system. This understanding casts the ziggurat as a political statement embedded in brick. Its scale reflects not personal ambition, but the capacity of the king to maintain continuity across generations. Each rebuilding ties the present reign to a remembered past. Each inscription fixes the ruler within a sequence rather than elevating him above it. When kingship is viewed this way, Investment in monumental construction appears less like devotion and more like maintenance of a framework that supports authority itself. The ruler does not build to impress the divine, but to demonstrate alignment with an order that governs both gods and men. The structure stands because governance demands it. If ziggurats functioned as material confirmations of rightful rule, then their importance lies not only in what occurred upon them, but in what they signaled to those who could not ascend them. And if building was an obligation rather than an expression of piety, what kind of activity required such careful, repeated affirmation of authority through stone and labor? If construction affirmed authority through continuity and labor, that authority still required daily articulation. It had to be recorded, checked, and remembered. Near the raised platforms, the ground yields not altars or offerings, but tablets, thousands of them pressed with numbers, names, and commodities. Their presence shifts attention from what the ziggurat symbolized to what it supported in practice. Excavations around ziggurat precincts consistently uncover dense clusters of administrative material. Economic tablets appear in rooms with benches, storage jars, and ceilings embedded in floors. These are not scattered remains, but concentrated archives. The tablets record deliveries of grain, allocations of labor, disbursement of rations, and inventories of livestock. Their language is technical and repetitive, concerned with accuracy rather than expression. They describe systems in motion. Linguistically, these texts are utilitarian. Verbs denote receipt, transfer, and balance. Nouns specify measures, containers, and personnel. The writing does not explain why these transactions matter. It assumes their importance. This assumption suggests an audience already embedded in administration. The tablets function as nodes in a network of accountability, not as messages to the divine. The physical placement of these archives is telling. Many are found within or adjacent to the same controlled precincts as ziggurats. In some cases, tablet rooms occupy elevated ground or are situated on terraces connected to the main platform. Elevation here appears practical. Height protects from flood damage, limits casual access, and marks the records as distinct from domestic space. The archive is separated from the city not by distance, but by level. Ceilings reinforce this separation. Clay lumps bearing seal impressions once closed containers, doors, or bundles of tablets. Their imagery often includes symbols of authority rather than religious scenes. The seal identifies responsibility. It marks who had the right to open, verify, or alter the contents. Control over records mirrors control over movement seen in the surrounding architecture. One corpus of tablets, recovered near a major ziggurat, details redistribution on a scale that exceeds household management. Goods flow in from multiple sources and are redirected outward according to schedules. The tablets track compliance. Shortfalls are noted. Surpluses are reassigned. This is not a record of offerings made and consumed, but of resources managed and preserved. The language of these records treats goods as units within a system. Grain is counted, not praised. Laborers are listed, not honored. Time is segmented into accounting periods rather than festival cycles. Even when religious institutions are named, they appear as administrative entities with inputs and outputs. The ziggurat looms nearby, but the tablets speak of balance sheets. Elevation may have contributed to legitimacy as well. Records, kept above ground level, within restricted precincts, acquire authority through inaccessibility. Not everyone can verify them. Their position signals that they belong to a higher order of knowledge. The archive becomes a space where decisions are fixed, insulated from dispute by architecture. Preservation is another factor. Flood layers across Mesopotamia demonstrate the vulnerability of low-lying storage. Archives placed near raised platforms would have survived longer, both physically and institutionally. Rebuilding phases often show continuity of record-keeping practices, even when surrounding neighborhoods change. The archive persists because the system it serves must persist. There is also the matter of training. Scribal schools are sometimes located within these precincts. Exercises found on tablets mirror the language of administration, not ritual. Students learn to count, measure, and record before they learn to compose hymns. Literacy appears first as a tool of governance. The proximity of education to archives suggests deliberate cultivation of administrative memory. Taken together, the tablets imply that the raised platform functioned as an anchor for record-keeping. Elevation concentrates authority, protects information, and reinforces hierarchy. The ziggurat, in this view, is less a destination than a backdrop, a marker that situates archives within a framework of permanence. If authority was enacted daily through tablets pressed, sealed, and stored near these platforms, the question shifts again. Was elevation chosen to protect records from the environment, from interference, or from challenge? And if knowledge itself was managed spatially, what role did height play in determining who could remember and who was required only to obey? If archives fixed authority through records preserved in space, another layer of control emerges through numbers fixed in form. The ziggurat is not only elevated, it is measured. Its dimensions are not approximate, nor are its orientations casual. Archaeology repeatedly shows that these structures conform to standards that extend beyond aesthetic preference. Precision appears intentional, and its purpose invites careful examination. Building measurements, recorded on tablets, correspond closely to the surviving remains. Lengths, widths, and heights follow ratios that recur across cities and periods. These ratios are not intuitive. They rely on established units and fractional systems that require training to apply consistently. The act of construction, therefore, presupposes a shared mathematical language, one capable of translating abstract quantities into physical space. Metrological texts found in administrative contexts reinforce this connection. They list standard units, conversion tables, and proportional relationships used in construction and allocation alike. When these texts are compared with ziggurat dimensions, the alignment is striking. The structure itself becomes a material expression of numerical order, built to embody the same logic that governs accounting and distribution. Orientation adds another layer. Many ziggurats are aligned with cardinal directions, sometimes with remarkable accuracy. This alignment is maintained through successive rebuildings, even when surrounding urban layouts shift. Such consistency suggests that orientation mattered independently of immediate practicality. It required observation, calculation, and correction over time. The process implies an ongoing relationship between the structure and the sky. Astronomical references in Sumerian texts are often practical rather than speculative. They track cycles, mark transitions, and regulate schedules. Calendrical tablets record intercalations and adjustments, revealing concern with synchronizing human activity to recurring celestial patterns. When ziggurats are considered alongside these records, their elevation and orientation appear less symbolic and more functional. height reduces obstructions. Fixed alignment stabilizes. Reference points. This does not mean that ziggurats served as observatories in a later scientific sense. There is little evidence for permanent instruments or dedicated viewing platforms. Instead, the structure may have provided a stable framework against which time and direction could be checked. The building itself becomes a reference, not a tool. Its persistence allows comparison across seasons and years. Precision also governs internal proportions. Terraces diminish according to predictable ratios. Stairways rise at consistent angles. These choices constrain movement and sight lines in mathematically regular ways. The body moving through the structure experiences regulated ascent, step by step, in measured increments. Space is not freeform. It is counted. Texts describing labor quotas and construction schedules further tie numbers to governance. Time is divided into workdays, months, and years aligned with calendrical systems. Completion dates are recorded. Delays are noted. The ziggurat, as a long-term project, integrates these temporal frameworks. Its construction spans cycles, reinforcing the need for accurate reckoning. The concern with precision extends to maintenance. Some inscriptions specify exact restoration measures, warning against altering dimensions. Deviation is treated as error, not innovation. This insistence implies that correct proportion mattered beyond aesthetics. The structure had to remain numerically faithful to its original form. When numbers, orientation, and proportion converge in this way, the ziggurat begins to resemble a fixed coordinate within the city. It anchors measurements spatially and temporally. It stands as a constant against which change can be assessed. In a landscape subject to flood, rebuilding, and political shift, such constants acquire importance. If the raised platform embodied numerical order as much as architectural mass, its role may have included regulating time, labor, and movement through reference rather than ritual. Precision becomes a means of governance, quietly embedded in brick and alignment. And if accuracy was essential to the structure's purpose, one is left to ask whether deviation from these measures would have disrupted more than it would have unsettled the systems that depended upon them if numbers fixed proportion and alignment stabilized reference. Another set of texts reveals how order itself was imagined. Legal and medical records from Mesopotamia describe systems that are layered, conditional, and hierarchical. They do not narrate ideals. They regulate processes. When read alongside the stepped form of the ziggurat, these texts suggest a shared way of organizing complexity through structure. Legal tablets present order as something assembled from discrete levels. Laws are not abstract principles applied universally. They are conditional statements activated by position, status, and circumstance. Penalties change depending on rank. Responsibility is distributed upward and downward. The system assumes stratification as normal. Justice is not flat. It is tiered. In these texts, authority flows downward, while accountability flows upward. A decision made at one level affects those below it, but justification is often traced back to a higher position. The logic resembles architecture. Stability depends on each level bearing weight appropriately. Collapse occurs when a layer fails to perform its role. Medical texts mirror this approach. Diagnostic tablets describe the human body as an ordered system of regions, symptoms, and sequences. Illness is not random. It progresses through stages, moving from one area to another according to recognizable patterns. Treatment follows this progression, addressing the system rather than isolated pain. The body is read as a structure that can be balanced or destabilized. These texts rarely isolate a single cause. Instead, they describe conditions emerging from relationships between parts. A symptom in one place implies disturbance elsewhere. The physician's task is to read these implications correctly. The language is careful, observational, and procedural. It treats knowledge as something accumulated and applied through precedent. When this systemic thinking is compared to the Ziggurats form, parallels emerge quietly. The stepped platform organizes elevation into discrete levels. Each terrace supports the next. Access changes with height. Not all movement is permitted, and not all positions are equivalent. The structure makes hierarchy visible without explanation. Legal texts often emphasize maintenance of order rather than punishment alone. The goal is restoration of balance. Similarly, medical treatments aim to return the body to its proper arrangement. In both cases, disruption is understood as misalignment within a system. Correction requires knowledge of structure. Some legal tablets include clauses about building responsibilities, specifying liability if construction fails. These clauses treat buildings as extensions of governance. Structural integrity becomes a legal concern, not merely a technical one. Failure of form implies failure of order. The built environment participates in the same logic as law. Medical texts also refer to spaces within the body that must remain unobstructed for health to persist. Channels, passages, and layers are described with the same vocabulary used for irrigation and architecture. The body and the city share metaphors because they share assumptions. Both are systems that must be kept in balance through oversight. This way of thinking does not require ritual framing. It operates through analogy and administration. Order is achieved by understanding relationships between parts and maintaining them correctly. The ziggurat, as a layered and regulated structure, fits naturally into this worldview. It does not need to symbolize hierarchy. It enacts it. If legal and medical texts reveal a culture accustomed to thinking in systems, the ziggurat's form may reflect that habit more than devotion. Its steps organize access, authority, and visibility in a way that mirrors how law organizes society and medicine organizes the body. The structure becomes legible as part of a broader logic of management. If so, the question becomes less about what ceremonies occurred upon the platform and more about how its form taught order silently. And if hierarchy was learned through space as much as through text, what role did such structures play in shaping how people understood their place within the systems that governed them? If legal and medical texts reveal how order was structured in law and body, mythological records show how the same logic was projected onto memory. When texts describing the Anunnaki are read closely, their concern is not devotion, but administration. These narratives do not dwell on worship performed by humans. They describe decisions made elsewhere, often in elevated places that function less as sanctuaries than as sites of allocation. In several compositions, the Anunnaki appear as a collective rather than as individualized figures. They convene, deliberate, assign roles, and fix outcomes. The language used to describe these gatherings is procedural. Actions follow sequence. Authority is distributed. Outcomes are recorded in memory rather than enacted through spectacle. The elevated setting serves to separate decision from execution. These texts rarely describe humans approaching such spaces. Instead, the emphasis is on exclusion. The place is defined by who cannot enter it. Elevation marks jurisdiction. What happens there determines what unfolds below, but the process itself remains inaccessible. The narrative assumes that such separation is necessary for order to persist. In one myth, the Anunnaki are said to determine destinies by assigning portions and responsibilities. The act resembles redistribution more than judgment. The language echoes administrative texts: to allot, to assign, to measure. There is no description of sacrifice, prayer, or ritual engagement. The elevated place is where records are fixed, not where worship occurs. The setting is often described in spatial terms rather than symbolic ones. It is high, enclosed, and distant. Its significance lies in function, not sanctity. Decisions made there are binding because of position, not because of ritual purity. The myth assumes that authority requires separation and height. When these descriptions are compared to administrative practices, the resemblance is difficult to ignore. Just as archives are elevated and restricted, mythic decision-making occurs away from the populace. Knowledge is centralized. Outcomes are disseminated downward without explanation. The structure of governance is mirrored in narrative form. Importantly, these texts do not portray the Anunnaki as objects of constant worship. They are managers of order. Their role is to maintain balance, ensure continuity, and prevent disruption. The elevated place is where balance is calculated, not celebrated. The absence of ritual language is consistent with earlier observations about inscriptions and architecture. The myths also emphasize inheritance. Authority is passed, roles are fixed, and systems endure beyond individual actors. Change is treated cautiously. Disruption occurs when roles are confused or boundaries crossed. Restoration involves returning to the established arrangement. The elevated place anchors this memory. In some accounts, disorder arises when decisions are made outside the proper place. The narrative treats this as error rather than rebellion. Correct procedure requires correct location. Space matters because it structures authority. Elevation is not symbolic ascent. It is functional separation. These texts were preserved, copied, and taught. Their persistence suggests that they conveyed more than belief. They articulated how order was understood to operate. Myth becomes a record of system logic, translated into narrative for transmission. The elevated setting is essential because it encodes hierarchy spatially. When read this way, references to elevated places in myth align closely with the physical presence of ziggurats. Both define zones where decisions are made and preserved, not performed. Both restrict access. Both assume that authority functions best when removed from immediate visibility. This does not require dismissing religious significance, but it reframes it. The sacred lies in correct allocation, not in ceremony. The divine operates through structure. The myth records how systems function, not how they are worshipped. If myth preserves administrative logic in narrative form, and if elevated places consistently host decision rather than ritual, the question arises quietly. Were ziggurats understood as the material counterpart to these mythic spaces, places where order was fixed rather than enacted? And if so, how did later generations come to remember them primarily as temples rather than as instruments of allocation and control? If myth preserves systems by translating them into memory, collapse tests which memories endure. Flood layers cut sharply through Mesopotamian cities, leaving behind clear horizons of disruption. Mud brick dissolves, floors vanish, and archives scatter. Yet again and again, above these layers, the raised platforms return. Their persistence after destruction offers a final lens through which to reconsider what they were understood to be. Archaeological excavations reveal flood deposits sealing earlier occupation levels across the southern plains. These layers are not uniform. Some are thin silts, others thick accumulations that bury entire neighborhoods. Domestic quarters are often abandoned or rebuilt with altered layouts. Administrative buildings shift or disappear. Yet ziggurats, or their foundations, are frequently rebuilt on the same footprint. Orientation is maintained. Elevation is restored. The choice is deliberate. Post-flood rebuilding inscriptions provide further detail. In several cases, rulers record not the founding of a new structure, but the clearing, repair, and reestablishment of an older one. The language emphasizes retrieval. Foundations are found, plans are recognized, dimensions are remeasured. The act is framed as recovery rather than creation. The structure is treated as something that must return if order is to resume. Flood narratives, preserved in later traditions, reinforce this perspective. They describe destruction not as an end, but as an interruption. What matters is what survives in memory and what must be restored physically to allow continuity. Elevated places often serve as points of reference in these accounts, marking where order was once fixed and can be fixed again. The concern is not loss of ritual, but loss of structure. Material evidence supports this distinction. In some post-flood phases, the function of surrounding buildings changes. Administrative quarters shift location. Archives are reorganized. Yet the ziggurat remains central. Its reuse suggests adaptability. Even if the activities associated with it evolved, its presence remained necessary. It continued to anchor the rebuilt city. There are indications that meanings attached to these structures changed over time. Later inscriptions include more overt religious language. Ritual references become more explicit. Processions are mentioned. This shift does not erase earlier functions, but it reframes them. What was once implicit becomes stated. Memory adapts to new contexts, layering interpretation over inherited form. This process of reinterpretation is uneven. Some rebuilding phases preserve older circulation patterns and access restrictions. Others modify stairways or add shrines. The variability suggests negotiation rather than replacement. The structure accommodates new practices while retaining its inherited role as a fixed point within the city. Flood layers also affect archives. Tablets are sometimes found redeposited, broken, or mixed with debris. Yet in certain cases, new archives appear near the restored platform, continuing earlier administrative traditions. Record-keeping resumes because it must. The ziggurat survival provides a stable location around which systems can be reassembled. The persistence of elevation is especially telling. In flood-prone landscapes, height offers practical advantage. But rebuilding at the same height requires effort. It is not the easiest solution. The choice implies value beyond convenience. Elevation matters because it preserves separation, visibility, and authority. It allows memory to be placed above disruption. Later cultural memory simplifies this complexity. Over generations, the layered purposes of the structure compress into more accessible narratives. The ziggurat becomes remembered primarily as a temple, a place of worship visible and comprehensible to later societies. Administrative and archival functions recede from memory because they are less visible, less dramatic, and less easily transmitted through story. What survives is the form. not the full function. The stepped tower remains, but the systems it once anchored are partially forgotten. The structure becomes symbolic, its earlier procedural role obscured by ritual emphasis. Memory selects what can be told, not necessarily what was most essential. Yet archaeology resists this simplification. Each rebuilding layer preserves choices that speak quietly of continuity. The repeated decision to restore elevation, orientation, and placement suggests that something fundamental was tied to these structures, something that collapse could not erase. If floods tested what a civilization chose to remember materially, the Ziggurats' survival suggests it held a role deeper than ceremony alone. And if its meaning shifted over time as systems changed and memories faded, one final question remains. When later generations called these structures temples, were they naming what they had become, misremembering what they were built to preserve in the first place?